Hello and welcome to today's Textile Talks, everyone. My name is Samantha Lyons and I'm the Assistant Curator at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Today we're delighted to host the third session of Textile Talks. For those of you who are joining for the first time, this is a weekly virtual lecture series presented by 6 different fiber organizations, including Studio Art Quilt Associates, the International Quilt Museum, Surface Design Association, Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, and the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. All programs are held at 2 p.m. Eastern and 11 a.m. Pacific each Wednesday. We've had fantastic presentations so far from SAQA and the International Quilt Museum, and we look forward to future events, including next week's talk from the Modern Quilt Guild. In a little bit, we'll have our invited speaker, Melissa Leventon, present on the history of the artwear movement. During this presentation, if you'd like to ask a question, you can submit it either in the chat area or via the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Before I welcome our speaker, I want to first share a little bit about our museum. The San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles has been celebrating the art and culture of textiles with our audiences for over 40 years since 1977. We're proud to have a permanent collection that contains over 1,400 textiles, including historic and contemporary quilts, textile-based art forms, and garments from around the world. We have more than 800 dedicated members who support our endeavors, which include a vibrant artist in residence program, free community days, and after-hours Art After Dark events, and a full 4-season exhibition calendar each year. One of our current exhibitions, Inside Out, Seeing Through Clothing, actually inspired our involvement with today's guest speaker. This exhibition features the work of 11 artists from the Bay Area and beyond who explore the boundary between clothing and the self. Working in the fields of sculpture, installation, and textile art, these artists are looking at the dynamic relationship between clothing and the body and how it can become an important vehicle for communicating those invisible parts of ourselves and our experiences. So here are a few images of this show, although we invite you to visit our website and social media for a closer look. Our museum is currently closed, but artworks from this show and other museum happenings are posted regularly online. And we'll also have updates on museum reopening dates on our website. So if you're in the Bay Area, we're very much looking forward to welcoming you back once our doors are open. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's guest speaker, Melissa Leventon, an expert on the subject of wearable arts. Melissa is a curator and consultant specializing in European and American costume and textiles. Formerly Curator-in-Charge of Textiles at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, she is now principal of Curatrix Group Museum Consultants and Appraisers, and has worked with museums all over the US and abroad. Melissa has authored or contributed to many exhibition catalogs and journals, and teaches fashion history and theory at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. Melissa is also a board member at our museum. And on a personal note, I first encountered her work during my graduate studies at the University of Kansas. So I am especially excited to introduce such a foundational scholar and curator for me on my own academic path. So a very warm welcome to you, Melissa. Melissa, you are muted.
Okay. Webinar 101. Thank you so much, Samantha, and welcome everyone. I'm looking at a notice on my screen that says that my connection is unstable, so the technical problems are happening just at the beginning. But I am going to plow on. I'm amazed and delighted that so many of you have chosen to join us this morning for what will be a 20 or 25-minute talk that takes a very, very, very fast run through the artwear movement in the US with an emphasis on Northern California. It's where I live. It's where many of the artists who have worked in this medium live. I've been privileged to get to know many of them over the years that I've been working in this field. That's not to say that all of you from other parts of the world will be excluded, but in 20 or 25 minutes, there is a limit to the amount that I am able to share with you. So first, a definition, although I'm sure most of you know what artwear is, in case anyone doesn't. This is, as I've defined it, clothing made by artists rather than fashion designers from their own handmade textiles. So handmade clothes, handmade textiles. And Northern California, as I said, where I live, is one of the cradles of the movement, though it certainly did and does exist in many other places. Artwear was a latish revival and arrival to the broader craft revival in the mid-20th century, when a lot of artists rediscovered the challenges and rewards of making things by hand. It came out of the ferment of the 1960s, and it was a heady combination of craft and art, and also fashion. I'm going to be using the terms artwear and art-to-wear and wearable art interchangeably, and I want to talk for a minute about nomenclature, because I think naming is very important to how we view things as a culture. I'm a recovering English major, and so I've always been interested in the word aspects of this. And for a long time, we've kind of tied ourselves into knots, trying to describe exactly what these garments are and where they fit within the broad categories of both art and also things that people wear. And there we go. And we've called these clothes by a bunch of different names over the years in an attempt to describe them in a way that the art world would understand and accept, because this is an art-facing genre. On the screen, you just see almost at random 4 catalogs that have been published over the years, that each one with a different name. So this is handcrafting clothing, as I said, made of handmade textiles by artists using a whole host of techniques that were common to fine art and craft and fashion all mixed together. And consciously or not, using the modifier wearable highlighted the fact that, at least for some people, these clothes were not just art, pure and simple. I date the start of the artwear movement to the mid-1960s, but it is connected to a much longer interchange that clothing and art have enjoyed. Fashion and textiles suffuse portraiture and other forms of representational art, and fine art has in turn provided an awful lot of juice to fashion over the years. You just see a couple of random examples on the screen. Sonia Delaunay, who was a very well-known Cubist artist, but also a very successful fashion designer, and Yves Saint Laurent, whose Mondrian collection was probably his most famous. But the artwear of the 1960s and early 1970s was formed by a combination of the craft revival growing from a new generation of art school trained craftspeople that emphasized the idea of the artist craftsman, as well as the street styles that were worn by hippies and rock and roll musicians and just sort of teenagers in general. So you had public figures like Janis Joplin, you see her at the top left, in her recycled tablecloth pantsuit made for her by her roommate and sometime lover, Linda Gravenites. And apparently, I never met Linda, but I've been told that she would only make clothes for you if she knew you and liked you. So presumably, if she knew you and didn't like you, you were out of luck. There's also Tom Donahue on the top right, a DJ at an underground rock station in the Bay Area called KSAN, in his artwear clothing, embroidered and pieced. There is Richard Colden on the bottom left, also known as Scrumbly, who's one of the infamous Coquettes drag troupe, and counterculture mainstays like Alexandra Jacopetti Hart of the Morning Star Ranch Commune in Sonoma County. whose embroidered shirt for her then husband was full of symbols and scenes of their lives together, later published by her in 1974 in a book called Native Funk and Flash, which, as we will see, had a role to play much, much later on. So lots of people, not just people like these, were doing this. You see on the left, for instance, Marianne Schildknecht. She's wearing this fabulous embroidered blouse. It's one of the most elaborate pieces I've ever seen. And she was in jail in Turkey on a hashish smuggling charge. And while she was there, the nuns taught her how to embroider. So she ripped up her bed sheet, made herself a blouse and a skirt. This is just the blouse, and created this amazing embroidered work. You also have Alan Copeland in his patched jeans made by his wife. He was a little bit older. He was a photographer in Berkeley, and he was documenting the student protests on campus, and he decided if he dressed as you see him on screen, he'd fit in a little better with the people that he was photographing. So there are lots of reasons that people were making and wearing these things. And tremendous value was placed on this kind of handwork. People thought that it gave a soul and an integrity to the garment that industrially produced examples just did not have, and also that it promoted a deep social connection between maker and user. And this is classic anti-fashion, style that sits in opposition to whatever the mainstream fashion is doing, which is great until the mainstream absorbs it, which it pretty much always does. And that's naturally what happened here too. The music industry was especially active in pushing out the imagery of these kinds of clothes to the mass market. So naturally, it attracted the attention of very high-end designers. You see Yves Saint Laurent on the left, who needs no introduction, I expect, and Thea Porter on the right, each with their own versions of rich, hippie looks. Very expensive, very high fashion, but riffing on the same kinds of influences. At the mass market level, you have the Levi Strauss Denim Art Contest in 1974, in which the company, based in San Francisco, essentially advertised its products by showcasing what its customers were doing to them. They selected 50 winners, including the two that you see on the screen. I believe these were both honorable mention, from literally thousands of entries. And then they put together an exhibition of the 50 winners, and they sent it around the country and also to Europe. So they too were responsible for pushing out a lot of this imagery. So a lot of what I've shown you so far could be considered folk art. It was made by people without formal training who did not pursue it as a profession. But it also resulted in a number of women beginning to experiment with clothing starting in the mid-1960s. And these were people who were both self-taught and who also had formal fine art training. Many had been taught basic textile skills by female relatives or in school. I think the idea of making textiles and clothes as art was especially attractive to women, in part because the feminism of this period emboldened women and female artists in particular to recontextualize textiles as art. You can tell the artists who made these were young and energetic and just exploring the possibilities of what they could do in textiles. And you can also see in these four examples the geographical divide between style and the East and West coasts. Wearable art developed in both places simultaneously, but you see the two pieces from the West Coast on the top. Kaylee Manuel on the left, who went to San Francisco Art Institute, trained as a painter, decided that she did not want her paintings to spend the rest of their lives in some museum's basement. So she started painting clothes so they could get out and about in the world. Yvonne Porcella on the right, well known as a quilter and the founder of Sakwa. This is what she was doing in the late 1960s and 1970s. We're making these collaged garments with amazing textures and colors. And in this case, a couple of molas from the 1930s repurposed as sleeves. These are painted, these are collaged, these are much lighter weight compared to, which is appropriate for the climate on the West Coast. Whereas on the bottom, you see two pieces from the East Coast, both made in the New York area. At the time, Janet Lipkin, African mask from about 1970, crocheted wool with leather insertions, and Nikki Hitz Edson's Medusa mask, photographed on a median on the West Side Highway in New York. And I think Nikki's mask, I asked her for a slide of this yesterday because for me, I think it encapsulates a lot of the ways a lot of us are feeling right now as we're in quarantine. But it's also very emblematic of how adventurous and out of the box a lot of this work was, but it's heavier, it's warmer. The climate in New York is colder. And so it makes sense that the work reflected the artist's surroundings. So far, we've seen a variety of garments, but in the 70s, a number of artists gravitated towards coats as their primary garment choice. And it makes sense for anybody focused on surface decoration, since obviously that's usually the garment you wear on the top. These coats were mostly in T-shape, either true or modified. It's a very old and simple form. It has been and remains a mainstay of non-Western garb, and it's canvas-like. So it was conducive to displaying imagery. It didn't require that you cut into your laboriously handmade textile. And it was really easy to make, which was perfect for anyone who wanted to make clothes, but didn't necessarily have training in fashion design or pattern drafting. The default name for these in the artwear world is usually kimono, although many are actually based on other T-shaped garments from other places. And they tend to be displayed as you see them on the screen with their arms out, which is especially important for a representational piece where the picture continues across the sleeves, and also with their front flaps folded back. By the mid-1970s, wearable art had a number of practitioners, some interest from museums, and very important, a couple of galleries. Most notably, there were many galleries, but I'm just going to talk about two, and that was Julie Artisans Gallery in New York on Madison Avenue, and Obiko in San Francisco, initially on Sacramento Street. Both of them opened in 1973. Julie followed more of an art gallery model, and Obiko, which was this tiny jewel box of a store, was more of a boutique. Sandra Sakata, its proprietor, was really interested in the wearability of wearable art, and she was famous for her ability to put together pieces by different artists to create amazing ensembles. Artwear in the San Francisco Bay Area was further influenced by the academic programs in textiles and fiber art that were run by some major names in studio craft, notably Ed Rosbach in Berkeley, his wife Catherine Westphal at UC Davis, who was known for her textiles, but also made some garments. Here's one from 1970 at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston now. And also the Bauhaus-trained Trude Germonprez at what was then called CCAC, now is CCA where I teach. Independent organizations such as Fiberworks Center for the Textile Arts in Berkeley, which had a 15-year lifespan from 1973 to 1988, offered classes and workshops and exhibition opportunities, and they also played a crucial role. Dyers were already well established in California, but in 1975, Fiberworks was responsible for what is, as far as I know, the first class in the US in the sophisticated Japanese manipulated resist dyeing technique called shibori, which was taught by artist Yoshiko Wada. Ceramicist Annalisa Hedstrom was in that class, and it turned her attention from ceramics to textiles. And she has gone on to become one of artwear's most distinguished practitioners. And her work and her teaching, along with Yoshiko's, are majorly responsible for shibori becoming one of artwear's most characteristic techniques. So by 1980, wearable art was firmly established and was entering its mature phase. The work, which had been exuberant and oppositional in the 60s and 70s, became smoother and more sophisticated in the 80s and 90s, which suited contemporary tastes very well. For an awful lot of artists, process and technique and figuring out how far you can push them was really key. A lot of pieces have an elaborate, almost obsessive quality. I look at them sometimes and I think that the artists had really somehow totally lost themselves in the process of making. They were so absorbed and so focused. They were really in the moment or in the zone, in the way we sometimes describe performances. That's certainly true of some of the very early dimensional crochet pieces that Sharon Hedges and Dina Knapp and Janet Licken were making. Janet once explained to me, she basically said, we just went nuts. But it also can be true no matter what the technique. You see 4 examples here on the screen. Just the list of materials and processes in the coat on the top right made by Marion Claydon and Ben Compton seems almost mind-boggling. Kaylee Manuel, bottom right, painted tiny images repeatedly on white feathers to create her kaleidoscopic multi-tier collars, a process that she developed through experimentation. Tim Harding, who once told me that he'd taken some fabric out to his backyard and shot it with a rifle, just to see what would happen, is the person who used the unlikely technique of reverse applique to painstakingly create what looks like an impressionist forest landscape. And top left, Candace Kling turned the complex ribbon folding techniques that she learned by studying the embellishments on Victorian and Edwardian women's clothes into a transformative headdress. I haven't talked about content beyond technique, but that is also a key element. Although works that are purely aesthetic are no less worthy, the focus on external subjects is one of the ways dress has gotten itself taken seriously in Western art and academia, and that's true here as well. The range of subjects is as varied as people working in this sector, but one of my favorites is humor. Fashion isn't often funny, but artwear is not afraid to make you laugh. Keep Your Sunny Side Up on the right is a cocktail dress in the form of a cozy breakfast table with a very surreal bodice where eggs and bacon stand in for parts of the body that they're covering. Jean Williams Casaseto's raincoat on the left is equally subversive, but in a very different kind of way. You can tell it's a raincoat because the text around the edges tells you so, but it's punch full holes. So the rain shower that it's depicting is likely to leave you completely drenched. Satire often plays a role in the word play. Both of the pieces on the screen comment about women's lives and roles in American society. We saw a piece by Charlotte Crook in Samantha's presentation before mine began. It's in the exhibition at the museum, which I hope many of you will have a chance to see once we reopen. But I also included an earlier piece in the artwear exhibition I did at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco in 2005. And this is her peach nectar dress. It's a punning fruit cocktail dress, if you like. And she made it of unused peach nectar labels. And the ones back here that form this ruffled back panel are stamped packed in saccharin, which implies that the wearer's sweetness is completely artificial. Gaza Bowen's The Little Woman's Night Out on the right is the second in her breakout series of shoes made from common household cleaning materials and equipment. In this case, copper brushes and scrubbies unraveled over leather, a couple of washers, a silver sink drainer mounted on gold and silver washboards, because after all, these are evening shoes. As these pieces both demonstrate, By the 1980s, some of the work was becoming quite conceptual, and it wasn't always wearable. The Bowen shoes are indeed real shoes, but they would not support anyone's weight. So things were already beginning to fragment. Tastes were changing. Some artists were beginning to burn out. And then in the early 1970s, when a recession hit, this seminal phase of artwear began to run out of steam. Some people hung on, and towards the end of the decade, there was renewed interest in the field and a younger generation starting to filter in. In addition, the 70s revival in fashion that started in the late 1970s prompted new interest by the fashion establishment in some early artwear. I mentioned Native Funk and Flash, and I'm about to get back to that. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, I heard a lot of complaints from people who felt that the mass market was ripping them off, but it got up into the highest echelons of the fashion system. This was in many ways the ultimate irony. Nicolas Chesquier, who was then the design director at Balenciaga in Paris, closely copied a Kazik Wong vest that had been published in Native Funk and Flash, and he sent it down the runway in his spring 2002 show. He got found out, the press picked up the story, and he eventually apologized. And when I saw the Balenciaga vest in Paris a few years later, Kazik was credited on the screen, on the label, as the inspiration. So there you have it. Over the space of 30 years, the counterculture essentially was completely absorbed by the fashion system and then put back out again. And with that, the story has come full circle. I see somewhere in the course of this, I lost the video, but I hope you enjoyed the talk. I will be happy to take questions at this stage. I will leave you with this to look at. Thank you all for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa. We have a few questions that have come in on the chat. So let me start off with one that was touched on, by you during your talk, but perhaps you can clarify. If I understand, you said that in artwear, the fabric was made by the artist. What is the definition of creating the fabric?
That is a very good question. And in some ways, it's a very challenging question to answer. In the early days, in many cases, a lot of people wove, they crocheted, they knitted. They literally did create the fabric from the ground up. But in a lot of cases, the Kazik vest that we're seeing, for instance, on the left, was created from commercial fabric. So what was created essentially was the collage. And many people did use found objects. Yvonne Porcella, in that early piece I showed you, also created that garment from collaged pre-existing textiles. And some artists used commercial textiles that they then added handmade elements to. The Dina Knapp piece that I showed a little while ago called Mother of Pearl Kimono, for instance, used a commercial fabric as the base of the kimono, but the snakes on top of it were crocheted by her. And so in a lot of ways, it means a lot of different things depending on how you're looking at it. Someone like Annalisa Hedstrom or Annie Dyer often starts with, again, a commercial fabric that is then modified.
Okay, great. We have a pair of related questions here. What direct roles of subversion and subversive norms have played out in artwear, and how has this evolved? We also have a question that asks, has anyone used artwear to explore sexuality and gender bending? I'm sure there's lots to say about that.
Oh, there is a lot to say about that. I'm not sure in the context of this I can necessarily answer fully. I'm going to take the last question first because that's what's on my mind, and gender bending. There was not a lot of gender bending in my recollection in what you might call mainstream artwear in the gallery or the boutique sense. Much of this was made by women with the expectation that it was going to be worn by women, or frankly just displayed. There are many pieces that were made that are amazing that were never worn. And there also are men working in this genre. And they are making garments that are essentially, I think they were concentrating on the garment, and the kimono form in theory can be worn by anybody who chooses. I don't think the artist necessarily prescribed who it was going to be worn by. If indeed it was going to be worn, that was left up to the wearer. But you do see in a lot of the performance pieces, and I did not really have the time to address the performance aspect of artwear, but there is a considerable performative subsection of this genre. And there's a lot of gender bending that went on in the performance. The person who comes to mind most readily is Kazik Wong, again, whose vest you see on the screen. Kazik imagined that the garments that he made could be worn by anybody. He himself modeled quite a lot of them, including for a rather subversive fashion photograph that made it into Harper's Bazaar in 1972, where his piece is posed next to a Hanai Mori kaftan, very beautiful, very flowing, printed with butterflies. And the Hanai Mori is on a female Asian model, and Kazik is modeling his own outfit, but it's presented as women's wear. So, so he was one of the people who was very interested in gender bending, and a lot of the people dealing with performance were doing gender bending kinds of things. But you don't find it so much, at least in what the artist is putting out in the more mainstream things earlier on. And could you repeat the first question, Samantha?
The first question related to issues of subversion, subverting norms. And I think that question has gone away at this point, but just discussing, how artists who are creating wearable art might be using clothing to bend rules of normative society.
Okay. In a lot of ways, what started out as very non-mainstream. If you look at the street style aspects where people were taking mass-produced clothes, blue jeans, chambray shirts, other kinds of garments, and they were customizing them. So that was one way in which the norms of society and the norms of fashion were being pushed. A lot of the smaller practitioners early on were also creating clothes, in small production where the wearer and the maker were known to each other. There was a much closer connection. So this was an attempt to really get around the industry focused on mass production, on inexpensive, on widespread, and on everybody in a lot of ways looking very much the same, even though we prize individuality. Wearable art has always, in many ways, has a very theatrical aspect to it. And that, I think, has stood in contrast at various times. One of the reasons that I think it kind of ran out of steam in the 1990s is that fashion, which had been pretty accepting in the great scheme of things, of this sort of subset. It was more decorative, it was more theatrical, it had a non-Western flair to it in many ways, became less accepting of that. As tastes change, we entered a recession, colors got dark, things got plain, the silhouette got straighter. There were a whole host of things that conspired to sort of push this off the edge. But pretty much everything that is made for people to wear, that people actually wear, exists within the larger framework of what fashion will accept at any particular time. Because if you think about it, it's very difficult to go completely off the grid in what you are wearing. You get a lot of pressure and a lot of pushback from the people around you. So although I think wearable art did in many ways push the envelope in a lot of fashions, it never fully got outside what certain aspects of wider society would accept. But I also think that one of the reasons that it flourished in Northern California is that this was one of the hearts of the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, and is still in many ways much more accepting of I hesitate, eccentricity is the wrong word, but difference, if you like, in clothing. And I think that it was a very hospitable environment for that.
Great. Another question we have, you've talked about art and craft influencing fashion. Mm-hmm. Do you see current fashion trends influencing art and craft in modern day quilt making, for example, or perhaps other genres?
I'm really not very involved right now in looking at what modern day quilt makers are doing. So I don't really feel qualified to answer that question. But all I can say in a very general term is that I think, yes, whatever is going on in the world is influencing creative people who are working. You can't avoid the environment you live in. You're going to be making work that speaks to you and the circumstances you find yourself in and the things that excite you and interest you. So whatever is going on in the wider world is going to be filtering in. But that's all I really feel able to say about that.
Okay. We have a very topical question. Do you have thoughts about the role of the mask in coming months as it relates to art to wear?
That's a fabulous question. And I thought, I'd actually thought about ending with Nikki's Medusa mask because it was indeed so timely. I'm seeing articles every day in the various industry things that I read that have to do with this designer and that designer making masks. And I think that masks are going to start becoming more and more an integral part in how we think of dressing. And obviously there are going to be some of us who continue to wear the kind that you can buy at the hardware store as long as the hardware store has them in stock. But I think a lot of people are going to be getting very creative. People already have gotten creative in the masks that they're making, the fabrics they're making them of, how they are styled. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. And masks themselves have a long history in Western fashion, both for masquerade purposes, but also if you look at 16th century illustration by people like Wenceslas Hollar, you often see women wearing masks during the winter to protect their complexions from the cold. And so I think those were fashionable. And so I think that we have a whole new era of fashionable masks potentially stretching out in front of us. And it will be very interesting to see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question that concerns your role as a curator. When you display work, do you consider the three-dimensional aspect of a garment? For instance, the wall hanging pieces are fascinating, but give no idea of the look it would have if worn on a body. Do you think there are more artists who are drawn to making their work based on the shaping of fabric to a three-dimensional form? This person is thinking of your fried eggs and bacon dress.
Well, there's some pieces obviously that don't work unless you wear them on the body. That particular piece makes no sense. If you pin it to the wall, you lose the humor. But for a lot of the pieces that were made in the 70s and 80s, I know that people were envisioning them as having a dual role, that they needed to work both on the body and also on the wall. And so it depends very much on the piece and on what the artist had in mind, and also as a curator, whether I think it works in 3 dimensions and whether it works on the wall. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about a museum display, you obviously are not seeing garments in motion. And that's part of the intent when you make something for wear, is actually watching it move. And it's a challenge in museum display of costume because it's not going to be moving. The most you're going to be finding is a mannequin on a turntable slowly revolving, but that just does not, that doesn't take the place of actually seeing it on a live person and watching it walk across the room or walk down the street. And so oftentimes for pieces that do work on the wall, it's great to show them on the wall, because what you can concentrate on is the imagery, on the surface, on the texture, on the graphics, and all of that, when how it looks on the body is perhaps less important. But it's a trade-off, and it's really a question of an analysis piece by piece, as well as the constraints that your gallery puts on you and all sorts of other stuff that I won't get into when you're developing an exhibition.
Okay, great. You included a few images of exhibition catalogs at the beginning of your talk, including the recent show Off the Wall, American Art to Wear, an apt title, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art last year. Are you familiar with this show, and can you maybe talk about any significant differences that might have been informed by the nearly 15 years between this show and your show Artwear at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco in 2005?
Okay, that's a big question. I am familiar with the show. I was very happy to be invited to the opening, and I went, and it was wonderful and amazing. I spent so much time talking to people I hadn't seen in years that it was hard to take it all in. There are some significant differences between the show that I did and the show that was done in Philadelphia. And one of them is that the Philadelphia exhibition was heavily focused on the collection that was amassed by Julie Schaffler-Dale over her 40 plus years probably, of running Julie Artisans Gallery. I believe there are 44 pieces from that exhibition that have been promised to the Philadelphia Art Museum, which is fabulous, and were the focus of the show. And so there was a more East Coast orientation. Mine was a more West Coast orientation because, again, that's where I am. And Dilys Bloom, the curator of the show in Philadelphia, made a very conscious choice to focus on the United States, whereas I looked more globally. I included pieces from outside the United States. I included pieces that represented performance, and Dilys did not. And she had a slightly different take on the section of setting the context for art to wear. She looked at it more as how it had come from the studio craft and studio textile movement in the 1950s and earlier 1960s, whereas I looked at it more as how it had come from the street style, particularly the street style that was centered in California. So those were some of the differences that I saw. And partly because of the 15-year difference, the options for media in the exhibition changed. Dilys had a couple of really wonderful video presentations that I did not have that supported her work and the pieces that were in her exhibition very nicely. And the installation also looked very different. Hers was white walls, each piece in its own space, and mine had a lot more color. Things were closer together. I chose to position them as they related to each other a little bit more. So design-wise, it was a little bit different as well. So those are some of the differences that I saw. But it's a wonderful show. I have no idea if it is going to still be up when the museum is able to reopen, but for anyone who has not had a chance to see it, and if it does reopen, I urge you to go.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for just a couple of more questions. Are there key places that are collecting wearable art from the early 90s?
I don't know.
More in general, places that are collecting wearable art that you could point people to if they want to learn more.
Okay. Well, Philadelphia Art Museum is definitely one. I'm not sure what the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco is doing right now because I am no longer on the staff there. They certainly have collected some of the pieces that were in my Artwear exhibition. Subsequently, Jean's raincoat comes to mind. And they may well be continuing to collect. Places like the Racine Art Museum have long collected contemporary craft, including Artwear. Museum of Arts and Design in New York has also had a long-time collection. And the Boston Museum of Fine Arts also has a collection. So those are the museums that immediately come to mind, where people are likely to find artwear if they would like to see more and know more. There's at least one piece still at the Costume Institute in New York, and it is available online. That's Mark Mahal's safety pin jacket. But I don't know that the Met has much else.
Okay. And someone has pointed out in the chat that the Phoenix Art Museum may be another valuable source for wearable art. Okay, I think this will be a good question to end on. Can you name 3 artists that are working now in wearable art that perhaps you'd like to put on our radars? Many more than that. You can narrow it down to 3.
There are way more than that. I'm actually going to toss this question over to you, Sam, because I think you have been in the thick of this, working with your exhibition, and I think you are better positioned than I am to answer that.
Sure. Yes, so I think maybe the 3 that come to mind, some of you may be familiar with them. Certainly Nick Cave is an artist who you can pretty much find a work of his in every major museum of modern and contemporary art now. He's known for creating these beautiful sound suits that fully cover the body in different colorful materials. They're intended to be worn, often performed in, and they make sound and just gorgeous movement for those who are wearing them. So certainly Nick Cave is an artist to check out. I would also say Raoul Deneve is another artist who displayed his work in the Whitney Biennial in 2017, who's known for similar wearable art. Let's see, and also, I mean, Charlotte Crook is a fantastic artist who is in Inside Out, Seeing Through Clothing. She creates these fabulous garments that technically can be worn, although they are a bit more kind of conceptual. They're made of leftover packaging from food waste. The work we have in our show is called Let Me Bake Cake, and it's this wonderful Marie Antoinette style gown that's made of every element of packaging you would need to make a cake. So she's an artist who is working to upcycle her materials and, you know, really proving that you can make art out of pretty much anything. And it's fabulous. So I encourage you to check out those 3 artists, but there are, of course, many, many more.
And I would just add about Nick Cave that before he started making sound suits, he was making artwear for men. He had a company called Robave in Chicago with a partner. And he made really interesting clothes that were not necessarily intended for performance. So he's had a very long career kind of on both sides of it.
Right, and I'll also note too that he's a blue chip contemporary artist, but he's
Oh, yeah.
also the director of the fashion program at the Art Institute of Chicago. So I think certainly in the contemporary art world, you have there's permeable boundaries now between art and fashion, and artists can kind of coexist within both fields. Okay. So I think this is maybe a good place to end since we've worked our way up to the contemporary art period. I want to thank you again, Melissa, for this exciting and informative talk, and to all of you for attending. We'll be sharing this presentation on our YouTube and Facebook page afterwards. If you enjoyed this talk and would like to donate or become a member, please visit our website, sjquiltmuseum.org. And we look forward to seeing you next week with the Modern Quilt Guild. Thank you again, and take care. Bye, Melissa.
Bye, Samantha. Bye, everyone.